I love that phrase. The snarling, snapping, unmuzzled dogs. Or in other words, the individuals who live, so to speak, outside the fence. The ones who are camped on the other side of the fence with their campfires, their pots, their marshmallows, or whatever the hell they have over there. In other words, you see, when you look at the world as a whole, actually most people in it are the ones we can only refer to rather nervously and gingerly by means of those terribly melodramatic and almost hysterical words like wretched, miserable, unfortunate, desperate, powerless, poor. That's a very sympathetic one. Or in other words, to put it a bit differently, God bless them, they're people who simply have no resources of any kind at all. And these particular people, and God knows why, they just don't like us. They don't like us. They simply don't like us. So it's not hard to see what will happen one day. There's the majority, them, the minority, us, and the way they feel about us. Great dislike. Very, very great dislike. So enemies are not exactly imaginary beings, you see. They're very, very real. But I'll tell you something interesting about enemies. At least this is how I feel about it. I'm sure you know that rather nasty and not terribly thought-provoking old saying that the enemy of my enemies is my friend. Well, what's much more true to my sense of life is that the friend of my enemies is for sure my enemy. While in a funny way, my enemies themselves don't bother me that much, and in an odd way, I can even work up quite a bit of respect for them, looking at it all from a certain point of view. It's that thing of people whom you actually know, and with whom you actually live, deciding consciously to become the friend of your enemies that can get you really terribly upset, because your enemies, after all, are trying very hard to kill you, no matter what you may happen to feel about them. And this is where things with Judy and Howard really became so difficult, because they'd worked themselves around to being so horribly appalled by the revolting rats whom they saw encroaching everywhere on their perfect existence, that they ultimately decided that the people whom they actually ought to like were, yes, that's right, precisely the ones who were sitting around making plans to slice our guts out. Or in other words, to perform that gesture cleverly referred to by one of our enemy-loving writers as the disemboweling of the over-boweled. And that became ultimately rather revolting to me. Weirdly, of course, and who can really say for sure about this kind of thing, you might say that the beginning of the end for me with dear old Howard came about one night when we were all sitting around after an early supper, Howard and Judy and the usual crowd, and all of a sudden we decided we would go to see a play. We would all go off to see this play that had been incredibly popular for that whole year, The Trojan Horse by Reginald Longleat. I imagine they were all in one of their occasional fits of sociological prurience, and they just wanted to see what nonsense the public was consuming that year, God knows what. I imagine I went along because maybe I actually thought I would like the play, have some fun, even enjoy myself, God forbid, or some such absurdity. Anyway, I guess I must have been the last one in line to get my ticket for the play, because they were all seated together in a group, and I sat alone 2 rows ahead of them. Well, the play was supposed to be this charming comedy, but the writer's hatred for the human race, or for everyone not just exactly like him, one might say, kept oozing out of it like blood oozing out from a closet full of bodies. There was something about the writing. It was horribly jarring. One was constantly wondering, how in the world had he chosen these particular words? Was he just simply out of his mind, or what? Can any word at all be used in any way? Longleat's conception of grammatical forms made me think of some sort of corrupt plumber who had screwed into alignment some series of pipes that never were intended to fit together, where, the whole thing was absolutely bound to explode, but maybe not until its maker was safely out of town. It was all so ugly, and the whole play was totally boring, and it wasn't even funny because all of the jokes fell totally flat. You know. And as I sat there watching this awful play, I began to feel an unexpected longing to turn around in my seat and look back at Howard. This just happened to be one odd moment when I really wanted to see Howard's face. I wanted to see that look of incredulous dismay, that rather exaggerated expression that even from a very great distance away you could read as saying, "Good God, is this actually occurring?" So, when Longleat served up this particularly witless, terrible joke, it was vicious as well, if one happened to notice it, and the sadistic audience was hooting with pleasure. I twisted around quite suddenly in my seat and looked directly over at our little group. But none of them saw me. They were laughing their heads off. Howard even more than the others. He was roaring with laughter in that eloquent phrase. And for a moment everything stopped. And I felt a sort of quiet but forceful spinning sensation. Well, so the next week was my birthday, and Judy had decided to have a party for me. About 50 people, all of their friends, even people I liked. A regular party. Paper hats, toy trumpets, games on the lawn, croquet, etc. And Howard had said, "I'll barbecue the meat." So it was the day of the party, and people began to come over around 5. And one of the families brought along a girl who was a student from Denmark. Well, I was drinking and joking around, and for whatever reason, and I wouldn't know because I'm not at all familiar with Danish culture, this student was quite attracted to me and found me very amusing and kept brushing up against me. So eventually we both sort of wandered off into the garage, and without giving the whole thing a great deal of thought, we were somehow kissing, and I'd put my hand underneath her shirt and was fondling her breasts. Well, all of a sudden, Howard came into the garage to get some coal for the barbecue, I suppose, and it was this farcical moment. The Danish girl ran off into the house. Howard ran off in the direction of the lawn, and I didn't know quite where to go, so I went into the tool shed. Well, there was nothing really to do in the tool shed, so I just sat there simply playing with my dick. And while I was playing with my dick, I looked through a little eye-level window, and I saw Howard wandering around on the lawn, not quite sure just how he should proceed.